Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am talking about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, test automation. Ironically, we're doing a podcast and we're talking about things, but our tagline for our test automation center is right here, "Let's talk more automation." I do realize the irony of that tagline while we're talking, but it represents our approach to being more pragmatic and deliver automation. So. Today I have with me Jason Murad. He is from Trumid Technologies. Jason, can you tell us a little bit about what Trumid does and what your role there is?
Sure. So Trumid is an electronic corporate bond trading platform. My role when it comes to testing is to automate our previously manual quality assurance processes with a specific focus on automating regression testing as well as trying to move our product lifecycle into executable specs. So the same specifications that are used to develop software become the tests to guard against regressions later.
That's awesome. It's a very basic question for those who are not in the testing function or are not in the on the IT side of the house. I as I said previously, I come from a test engineering background. I was a test automation engineer. That was my first job out of college. When things go right, nobody looks at the testing function and says, "Oh, developers, you did a great job." When things go wrong, they're like, "Didn't you ever test this thing?" So tell us a little bit about, Jason, why it's important for you to test and how that impacts the quality of the software that you produce.
In the early days, I guess Trumid's a startup going on something like 8, 9 years old at this point. In the early days, they got away with um, skipping automated end-to-end tests. They've always used unit tests to a high degree, but integration and end-to-end tests were kind of skipped in favor of using manual quality assurance, which actually worked well enough to get the startup off the ground. But as the surface area increased, you go from thousands to millions of lines of code, it just wasn't scalable or sustainable. And we had team of a dozen people repeating the same tedious manual steps every time we wanted to do a release. And so our releases went from every week to 2 weeks to 3 weeks up to like 6. And at that point, we said this is no good because they spend 5 weeks out of every 6 doing regression testing and only 1 week of that actually doing exploratory testing of the new features. So um, continuous delivery is probably the term that describes what we want to be able to do. And in order to be able to do that, get our new features out faster without being concerned about breaking pre-existing stuff, automation is the only option.
Absolutely. I tell folks this. This is interesting. You went, thousands of lines of code to millions of lines of code. You have X number of developers developing X lines of code every release. That's great. However, if you look at the testing function, the volume of work increases with every release. Not only do you have to test these new few thousand lines of code, you also have to test the previous tens and hundreds of thousands of lines of code that was written, and then that's just becomes unsustainable. And automation is the only way you can continue to reduce that cycle. Otherwise, it'll continue to grow, or you'll have to do the risk-based thing and say, maybe I don't test this thing and go on a hope and a prayer. So from a strategy perspective, it would be good to understand. Look, I think unit testing is great. Integration testing is needed. How do you decide between when to do UI-based end-to-end integration tests versus just exercising the APIs within your system to be able to say, okay, these functions I can do. So where do you draw the line? Where do you do the UI testing? Where do you do the API testing? And how do you string that all together between unit, API-based integration testing, all of that? How do you do that?
Good question. I would say it's not an exact science. There's no hard rules to it. In general, we follow the test pyramid, right? a wider base of unit tests. The smallest base at the top would be the UI tests with API and integration tests in between, going from mocked to non-mocked dependencies, such as databases and so forth. So there has to be communication between, sometimes the developer writes the code, and sometimes we have a special test automation engineer who writes the tests. In those cases, we usually ask questions about, all right, what is covered by your unit tests? For example, if you have an order entry form, it might have 50 different kinds of validation errors. Those are going to be covered by the unit tests. Do we want to and that's because they run much quicker than any integration or end-to-end test is going to run. And some of them do, some of them don't interact with other systems. So that's part of the identification processes. All right, I don't need to test all 10 of these that interact with the same limit service. So maybe I'll pick one of the 10 to be representative of integrating with limits. Whereas the unit test mocked what comes from limits, the integration test actually tests the real flow. Maybe there's 20 more that interact with the order book service. So we'll pick one of those. So we just try to get a representative sample of each connection, each integration a feature may have.
Perfect.
Sorry, and same deal with when it comes to API versus UI. So maybe we'll have just one test that says, all right, if there's an error, it shows in a red banner in the UI. But maybe we'll have 4 or 5 different API tests for the various kinds of errors. Because when it comes to the UI, you're just checking, does it display the error as it's supposed to? Not does it display each of the different 5 kinds of errors that's all going to result in the same UI display.
That makes a lot of sense. That's perfect. I want to get to, so in my day, my nirvana state was nightly regression before and letting folks know, hey, listen, the development folks, hey, you released something that I didn't know about. This release breaks that. What's your nirvana state and how do you want to get there? That kind of, where do you think the optimal execution of tests is, and what are the challenges to that? I think that's really the key. What are the challenges to getting there? I have a few, but I'd love to hear from you what the challenges are in getting there.
Time and cost are the first things that come to mind. These tests don't run instantly and don't run for free. So we have to make a judgment call on how often we run them and with how many machines. We built ours in such a way that it's scalable up to in terms of concurrency, up to whatever the platform can handle. So we could run 8 tests concurrently if we want to pay for that, or we could run 128 tests concurrently if we want to pay for that, and get it done or get the tests run that much more quickly, which means we could run the suite much more often, which means maybe rather than catching a regression 1 hour after it's merged into trunk, we catch it in 10 minutes. So we've balanced the costs and time. And right now we're at that point where about within 90 minutes of change going into our trunk, we'll have completed a test run and know. And right now for us, that usually in 90 minutes, you get on the order of a half dozen to a dozen commits. So it's usually pretty obvious when a test failed. Okay, look at those commits, which ones it's related to. We haven't gotten to the point we've heard some enterprises are at where they like automatically kick out commits. Right now, it requires a human to see what failed and then look at the commits and determine what we should either revert or fix. So the decision is usually, all right, can you fix that in 5 minutes? And so do it. It's going to take you a couple hours to fix, in which meantime, the test is going to keep failing. Just revert it and merge it back later with the fix. And sometimes the fix is actually to the test itself, right? Like the developer. Because unlike unit tests, our unit tests run on our pull requests because they're fast enough. So you can't merge something which fails unit tests. Because end-to-end test requires spinning up a whole environment, building, deploying. that's not tenable for us. So a true nirvana would be somehow that it's fast enough for that. That's not on our roadmap at the moment, but that would be nirvana. In terms of delivery, um, again, nirvana would be merging to master, it passing tests, and it being in production right after. Right now, we're aiming for daily releases. We're currently somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks where we could practically release. But if we could get to daily, we'd be very happy.
Oh, I think speaking to a lot of folks, I think you're way far ahead in terms of where you are. Just having tests being kicked off automatically, having that regimen of making sure that you have unit tests for all these things that run and results are actually communicated back to the full team. Being able to integrate all of this in the CI/CD pipeline through without manual intervention of somebody saying, "Oh, I have committed it. Go run this test," so on and so forth. That in itself is commendable. So that's awesome that you guys are there. I want to move to a little bit of a different topic. I want to ask you, Jason, about the impact of generative AI from both angles. So we're hearing about codex models that will spit out code. So on the inbound side, are you seeing the volume of code and the pace at which code gets developed increase? Um, a lot of times I'm seeing developers use some of these models to spit out snippets of code or parts of code that they would have had to write, and it would be much longer to do if they had to write it from scratch, but they're able to spit them out. And on the other side of it, I'm also hearing folks trying to use the generative capabilities of these models to be able to generate test cases and test data out of specification. So would like to get your thoughts on how you see the landscape evolving.
There's no doubt that tools like Copilot and ChatGPT massively enhance the productivity of developers here, whether developing features themselves or the test for those features. I have heard what you've heard, but I've yet to see or experience some the ideal of pointing some generative AI to a feature code base and saying, write tests for this. Also, I think that's a little bit opposed to the philosophy of test-driven development, where you actually write the test first. So maybe you could do it the other way. You write the test or the executable specifications first and ask the AI to write the code. That would be something wonderful to see.
That's interesting.
I have had some experience with, I think it's called model-based testing, which takes an API and then just tries to hit it with all sorts of variations of the inputs. I've not had luck with that, unfortunately, because I've just run into too many edge cases where it doesn't understand the bounds of the inputs and what the outputs mean.
Perfect. Yeah, I think this is a very fast evolving space. We are working with a few platforms that, at least from a manual tester's perspective, may be very helpful. The same sort of efficiency gains that developers might get from being able to generate code faster. I am seeing some tools provide the ability to generate test cases, for instance, out of specifications, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those seem to be very dependent on how well the specifications themselves are written. And again, I'm a little bit more wary um, of missed tests and missed scenarios by depending upon some of those functionality. But I've seen that, things are getting better in terms of, I think, as you start applying more domain specific knowledge, and I'm seeing some folks putting in some more domain knowledge into a model and then using that one, especially in very specialized industries. to be able to generate some of this stuff. That's actually been one of the things that I'm looking forward to. Let's see where that goes, but I haven't seen it completely put into production yet. So we'll all see where that goes.